HR leaders, what's on your mind these days? Is it AI? Is it the economy? The talent market? Remote work? Retention? DEI? Pay transparency? New laws? Our 2024 Workplace Trends Report outlines how HR leaders are thinking about these challenges and what they believe will help their organizations overcome them. Want to find out what they said? Head on over to peoplemanagingpeople.com/Workplace Trends 2024 and download the report to find out.
Whether you are leading a company, team, or starting something where you will be hiring, compensation is usually one of those areas that is top of mind. Do I offer bottom dollar and see if they accept? Do I offer top dollar to someone who has experience versus others? Or do I make everything transparent? Pay equity and transparency will promote a healthy culture and a thriving workplace. In today's episode, we'll hear from an expert on this topic. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Tim Reitzma, the resident host of People Managing People. Welcome to the podcast. We're people managing people, and we want to lead and manage better. We're owners, founders, entrepreneurs, we're middle managers, we're team leaders. We're managing people, and yes, we do human resources. But we're not HR, at least not in the traditional sense. We're on a mission to help people lead and manage their teams and organizations more effectively. So if you want to lead and manage better, if you want to become a better organizational leader and more effective people manager, then join us. Keep listening to the podcast to find the tips, tricks, and tools you need to recruit, retain, manage, and lead your people and organization more effectively. And while listening to the show, please subscribe and join our mailing list on peoplemanagingpeople.com to stay up to date with all that's going on. My guest, Robin Turnill, is a founder of Pivot HR Services here in Vancouver, BC, and, in my opinion, is an expert in all things HR. So welcome, Robin.
Good morning, Tim. Thank you so much for that kind introduction.
Yeah, I've known you for a while now, and we took a course and a coaching course years ago, and that's where we met and have stayed in contact. And so I've always really appreciated you and your insight and your friendship. So yeah, I'm so excited to have you on today's episode, really talking about pay equity and transparency, and we will talk about that gender gap. And so, but first, before we get into it, what's top of mind for you? How are you doing?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I am really excited to be on today, Tim. It's a funny thing. We did take that course. It was only it was a few day course, but it was several years ago now. But I still have this really clear vision of us salsa dancing in that course. So what's top of mind every time when I talk to you, the very first image I get is you and I salsa dancing in the middle of a group of people we barely know.
Yeah, that was, I may be blushing right now, and I'm glad people can't see me, my awkward robotic salsa dancing. Yeah, wonderful image to start things off.
Exactly. And I think we all need that laughter in some of the things that are going on today. I have to say, as a small business owner who supports other organizations, just seeing the tremendous changes that have happened as a result of COVID, but also being really impressed and the way that companies have been able to shift and respond, setting up their employees to work remotely wherever possible, and really being able to shift some of their business models to respond has been really impressive. So that's really what's been top of mind over these last couple of weeks, both in supporting clients, but in watching and observing all the many stories we're hearing about on the news.
Yeah, I think you and I could have a follow-up conversation, maybe even later on this spring or summer, just on the landscape of work. I know in British Columbia, it's dramatically changed, and around the globe, it's changed. And so when we're recording this in March of 2020, and I'm really curious to see what work will look like later on this year. Will it be a remote work culture now, or will it be one where everyone goes back to the office? So I'm really curious to see how this pandemic is shifting our work priorities. So stay tuned for that podcast. Just came up with that great idea. So thanks for that, Robin.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so today's episode, we want to talk about pay, compensation. And I know I've worked in an organization and, I've worked in a number of organizations, but one I worked with was really secretive about pay. They'd said, you cannot share this with anyone. This is top secret. Like it was a trade secret, or I was going to go to jail for sharing compensation. And so when I became a leader in that organization, it was ingrained in me that we can't share. And we can't share what people are making, specifically on roles. And so therefore, at least for me, I didn't think about pay equity. I didn't think about transparency. I didn't think about, was there an actual gender pay gap? And so, you wrote an article in an online magazine called People Talk, and we'll share the link in the show notes on pay equity. So what inspired you to write this?
Yeah. So at the time, Ontario had announced a Wage Transparency Act that they were just in the process of unveiling. And through that act, it became really apparent that BC was actually one of 4 provinces that didn't have any specific legislation that was moving towards addressing gender pay gap. And at the time, with Ontario coming out with what is pretty groundbreaking legislation, it inspired taking a closer look at that to determine what were some of the key principles of their legislation. And in that process, I will just say, I want to share about the legislation, but it's also important to note that they've put the legislation on hold. When the new Ontario Premier came into the province, that legislation has now been put on hold. So I don't know if it will end up being enacted. But what was created at that time, I think makes a lot of sense.
So, I know this, we're talking about British Columbia and Ontario here in Canada, and we do have listeners around the globe. And I think this is a topic that is so relevant to anywhere, any province, state, country that you're in, is looking at pay equity. And so, in the article, you talk about having an open and transparent pay system. And an open and transparent pay system specifically to help close the gender pay gap. So what is an open and transparent pay system?
Yes. So I think people often will get a picture of an employee list, this huge Excel spreadsheet with all of these employee names, and then right next to the names, every single person's salary, which is then just widely distributed, posted up in the lunchroom. It doesn't quite look like that. Here's what it can look like. I won't weigh in yet on whether or not it should look like this, but here's what it could look like. Typically, when we're talking about an open and transparent pay system, what we're referring to is that each role in an organization would have an associated pay range or set rate attached to it. So, for example, if you're a sales associate in an organization, you could expect perhaps that your pay range might go from 40 to 46,000 as an example. And so every single role that's in an organization would have that number attached to it. And therefore, anyone that was applying for any position would understand what the associated pay range was for the position that they were applying for. So in the truest sense, it's not about the individual, but it's about the role and the associated value that role brings to an organization.
Okay, so I do like the idea of everyone's salary on a spreadsheet posted up in the lunchroom, and maybe sitting back and watching the reactions. Maybe that's not the best course of action. But what I'm hearing is it's really just systematizing salaries and having ranges, I guess, for specific roles. So regardless of, say, John or Jane has applied for the job and we're going to offer Jane one number and John a different number, even though they've got equal experience, it's really putting some thought into the system behind the pay. Is that correct?
Exactly. And it imposes a rigor when you know that you're going to have to create these ranges for each of the positions. It allows organizations to be really thoughtful about thinking about, okay, what key skills, level of education, specific certifications, what are they going to be worth to our particular organization? And through that process, and there's a number of different ways that you can do this through what's called job classification. You can do it where you assign a point value. So let's say a job requires a master's degree, and that's going to be worth 20 points to that particular position to have a master's degree, versus a bachelor's degree might be given 10 points. And so when you're going through and you're gridding out roles that require a master's degree, their point value will end up inherently being higher. Or you might be asking for 5 years of managerial experience, and that would be worth a certain amount of points. If a role did not require any managerial experience, that would be worth less points. And so you tally up all the points for a particular role, and at the end of it, you might have your managerial roles having a point value, let's say, of 500, and those in senior advisor roles having point values of approximately 400, and so forth. And it creates this hierarchy. And then for each hierarchy level, you would have an associated pay range. Now, not every organization is necessarily going to be able to enact a point system, but there's far easier ways to do that. And that's to look and say, okay, we're going to play the matching game. We're going to take two positions in our organization and we're going to match them up. And we're going to say, which of these two positions is most valuable to our organization? What do we need more? And so in a paired position, you might say, okay, position A is inherently more important to us than position B. So A goes on top, B goes on the bottom. Now you pair up position B with a new position and so forth. And you start to slot roles so that you can get a top hierarchy all the way down to what would be considered sort of your entry level positions up all the way to your senior leadership positions. And so once you have, and that can take very short amount of time to be able to develop this hierarchy. And once you have that hierarchy set, you can turn your mind to what the pay should look like in those particular ranges. There's lots of different tools that you could use if you want to check it out on the market, right? You could do anything from PayScale to Glassdoor at a really quick glance, or roles that are posted on Indeed. So there's some really quick ways too that you can sort of check with market if you want to, and you don't have the resources to pay for a compensation consulting firm. And so that's a way. But what that allows you to do is be clear about what are the roles in terms of their value to the organization and how much should they be paid. And knowing that you're going to have to actually make that system transparent to employees, it lends itself to the leadership team really putting a lot of thought into that process.
Yeah, I think, I think back to a leadership role that I had a number of years ago, and there was a lot of questions around how salaries were determined. And, at the time we had performance reviews and salary reviews at the exact same time. So I'm pretty sure nobody ever heard what we gave in a performance review. They were just waiting for the number at the end. It's like, am I actually getting a raise or not? So there's people can do that, but I'd also potentially advocate for separating those two. But that's, again, another topic. But creating that transparency around that process. And because we were getting so many questions, we had a pretty large HR team. So we actually asked the HR team to run some lunch and learns on how we actually determined the salary. And we had a very complicated Excel file with salary data, point systems, ranges, experience, and that provided us I guess, the rigor. So when questions did come up, we were able to justify it. It wasn't just a name a number we just pulled out. So it's like, oh, I think you're 1% increase, or we're going to hire you at this dollar because, I think that's the best amount for your role. So it was very systematized. And I think that's what I'm hearing is a great takeaway for whether you've got a large HR team or you don't have anybody in HR to help with this, is having a system that's transparent to your employees and that you can stand behind. Exactly. Does that make sense?
Tim, you hit the nail on the head. It's really about the process. When people try to determine if they think their pay is fair, one of the very first things you'll hear them concern themselves with is, how did my employer decide how to pay me and what my pay should be? How am I paid relative to other people? It's that procedural fairness that people turn their minds to. I'll tell you an interesting story, actually, just to highlight that fact. I was in the process of doing an HR audit with a new firm that I was going to be working with. And one of the things that I was speaking to employees about is I was trying to get the lay of the land in terms of how they were feeling about some of the HR processes and policies that were in place at this particular organization. And one of the things we were looking at was their bonus process. And the bonuses were actually extremely generous. But interestingly enough, the employees deemed that they were unsatisfied with those bonuses. And when you got to the why that was so, it was because they had no idea about what their bonus was based on. So by all accounts, this was a pretty hefty bonus to be giving people. And in fact, I can tell you from sort of looking at the market that indeed they were paying over market at the end of the day for total compensation to the employees at their organization. But the employees were actually complaining about their bonuses because they had no idea how their bonus stacked up to the employee next to them. They didn't know the criteria upon which the bonus was set. And therefore, this company was paying a lot of dollars out for this bonus program that in fact was de-incentivizing people. And, I think there's a lot to be said about paying attention to the process. And I would also further surmise that an employer is paying so much of their operating budget in their salaries. Most employers, if you ask them, that's the biggest single expense that they pay out are their salaries and their wages. If they're not paying those out in a way that motivates and incentivizes their workforce, they're missing out on a huge opportunity. And that will invariably lead to people likely deciding to exit an organization or be there in a bit of a grudging way.
Yeah. And, having people sitting in seats, taking up that space in your payroll or in your organization who is not happy. Just think about the quality of work that's coming out of someone who is not happy or miserable. And, there could be a lot of various factors to lead to that. But if there's confusion around pay and confusion around how bonuses are paid, it's an opportunity. It's a real opportunity for employers, especially today, to bring light and bring about some transparency to that. So I kind of want to shift the conversation a bit. So if people are listening to the podcast, there's like 15 minutes of process, of setting up the process. And Robin gave a great example of a scoring system, a way to quickly get salary data. But I want to talk a little bit about, what do you believe is the root cause of pay inequity? Or, if we want to get specific, of maybe gender pay inequity.
Absolutely. So I think there's a multitude of factors that are present. The first one that I'll point out to is the fact that historically it's been women who have exited the workforce to be able to tend to children at home as a result of maternity leave. And what we have seen is that the longer that an employee exits the workforce for any reason, the harder it can be to re-enter the workforce and be able to make strides ahead. So for each long period where women historically, and even today, to still continue to be the primary parent that exits the workforce upon the birth of a child and stays with them. In Canada, we have great legislation that allows a parent to stay home up to 18 months. And a lot of women take advantage of that, maybe not even once, but twice or 3 times or more. And over the course of your career, although a human rights legislation is quite clear, you can't adversely impact someone who has been gone as a result of maternity. It tends to happen in any case. People will have been gone for a long time, maybe miss promotion opportunities. Perhaps when they come back, people write them off a bit, saying, oh, they won't have the time to devote to their work very much because they're going to have to leave early for recitals or doctor's appointments or because of any childcare reason. So I think that has been a huge barrier for women, both historically and still today in the present workforce, the impact of the maternity leave. And I also, pardon me, Tim, were you going to say something?
Oh yeah, no, I was just thinking about, as you're talking about, that didn't even cross my mind. I hadn't even really thought about maternity as a penalty, but you're right. I just think of someone who is off work for a year or a year and a half here in Canada, and then coming back, and potentially that's a year and a half of pay increase, and where all your colleagues are jumping ahead, but you might be kind of left behind. And so, I think that's just a useful a useful thing to think about.
Yes, it has a tremendous impact on women's earning potential. Certainly, it is an important factor. Another factor I would say is that historically, women's work, and I'm going to put that in quotations. You can't see me, but I'm doing air quotes right now when I say women's work. What I mean by that is traditional work that has been filled by women has often been work that has not been placed a high value on by society. So typically, childcare, early educator roles, women who work in daycare centers, women who participate in domestic work in terms of house cleaning, even teachers, when you see them next to, as a profession, they're still widely dominated by women teachers. And when you look at some of the male comparator roles, such as in policing, for example. So a lot of policing is male dominated. Again, I really want to stress, I'm in no way suggesting that there wouldn't be males in some of these more, what have been traditional female roles. And I'm also not saying that there wouldn't be women in some of these more male dominated roles. I'm talking about sort of large systemic viewpoint, taking sort of a bird's eye view of this and where the majority of people are when I talk about traditional male or female roles. And so when you look at the comparables, the traditional male roles pay more. And inherently, when we think about pay is a really deeply personal thing. Because at the end of the day, yes, pay equates to security and your ability to pay a mortgage and provide for your family and buy groceries and gas and the like. But it also goes to a deeper sense of people's self-worth, because pay, in essence, can be a reflection of what society tells you you're worth. So that can be very alarming when we start to think about pay for its overall symbol. And overall, what we've seen is that female-dominated roles tend to have been dictated by society to have been worth less from a pay perspective than male-dominated roles. And that has led to quite a disparity. A third factor is when we look at the types of programs that women versus men go into in university, and university, of course, being that gateway to the type of work that people will do afterwards upon graduation, we see not as many women represented in engineering, architecture, finance, a lot of business degrees, whereas women tend to be more involved in the social sciences, education, languages. And as a result of that, even though women are coming out, there's a higher percentage of women in Canada that are coming out with university degrees. They are, though, going into roles that actually pay them less than their male counterparts.
Wow. So 3 very, very good points that you make, Robin. And, I think, for me, I'm just thinking about, wow, as I'm right now building a business and will be hiring people in the future, is something we need to think about. Something that I need to think about is how we're paying our people and ensuring that we've got a fair process and an outlined process, and putting our biases aside, putting our thoughts of, okay, well, that's they may become a parent one day, so maybe I need to, not hire them or pay them less because they'll be doing less work. And as leaders in organizations, whether you have an HR team or not, we're responsible for those decisions, and we need to be able to justify those decisions. So I think it's pretty somber thoughts and points that you make. And so I thank you for sharing that. And so, I think as we're going through this conversation and wrapping up in a few minutes, what are a few practical things leaders can do to ensure that they're compensating fairly? We talked about the process, we talk about the gender pay gap, and especially with maternity and quote unquote, the male and female jobs. What can we do to ensure? Do we need to, again, post it in the lunchroom to ensure that we're fair? Maybe not. Do we need to hire a compensation consultant to review? What are some practical things that you can share with us?
Yeah, absolutely. There are. The good news is, regardless of the size of your organization, whether or not you have an HR department, there are a few practical things that can be done. So some easy tips, I would say, are to take a look at grouping your department. So taking all the roles in certain departments. So if I took all the roles in an accounting department and I sat down and I grouped the like positions together, like the people responsible for payroll or accounts receivable and accounts payable, and I grouped them all together and I analyze who's making more in this department. And so leadership, just taking a look at each department, and if there's a number of different business leaders, they can be responsible for doing that analysis for their department. So it doesn't have to be cumbersome, but taking a look at it with fresh eyes, that's a good way to start. The second is to determine some sort of process. Again, it does not need to be a hugely cumbersome process, although I would say the more rigor attached to it, the more defensible usually the system. So I would say that. So if an organization does need help with that, there's lots of outside people who can assist. But just being able to answer these questions. Why have we decided to pay this amount for this particular position? What is its value to our organization? So having that fresh look. And then what's really important is making sure you don't want the pay gap to continue to widen for genders. So as to be able to eliminate that from happening, posting salary ranges up there on job postings. We know by the research that women tend to negotiate less for their salaries. So if it's a blind posting where there's no compensation listed, by virtue of not having a range posted, women are less likely to negotiate, whereas men are far more likely to negotiate. So right from the get-go, you might be building the gender pay gap into your hiring decisions if you don't already have a clear publicized role, salary range for that role. The other thing that I would say is really important is, Tim, you mentioned this at the beginning, where people were actually getting, maybe hauled out of the workplace and sent off for disclosing compensation information. Well, the legislation that Ontario was primed to roll out actually prohibited employers from stopping employees from talking about compensation. Employees absolutely should be able to not be banned from being able to speak to each other about their compensation if they wish to disclose it. We find that the more secrecy there is, the more likely that there are inequities happening within a pay system. So those are a few tips to get people started.
That's great, Robin. As you were talking, I was thinking about a horror story from early on in my leadership career. So I took over managing a small team and was fairly new to the role, fairly new to the organization. It was my first leadership job, and so didn't really know what I was doing, kind of flying by the seat of my pants. And one of the employees was going on vacation and thought it would be a good idea to just send his email to auto forward to the team. Well, his pay stub was in one of those emails that was auto forwarded, and very quickly the entire team knew how much he made, and that really highlighted a massive pay gap in the team I was leading, and spent a better part of 6 months cleaning that up. And so what seemed to be an honest mistake actually led to significant repercussions for me and for the organization. We didn't lose anyone because of that, because we found that there was a pay gap. There was a serious problem, and we fixed it. And so if you're listening and you're thinking about your compensation plan, thinking about your team, don't be like me and wait for an accident to happen. Get on top of it. Do what Robin was suggesting. Take her advice, even as simple as just analyzing what people are making to see if there is some, uncovered bias or a mistake or something in your pay system. So, the title of the podcast is Mind the Gap, and it's so important to take a look at it now before any legislation comes down. I think it's the right thing to do. So with that, I just want to thank you so much for your time, Robin. You give so much practical advice and real advice. And again, we'll let our listeners know how to contact you. It's at Pivot HR Services. So thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Tim. It's always a pleasure to talk about this really important topic. And as a closing note, if I could just say, yes, we've been focused today on talking about the gender pay gap. I would just note that we also see that pay gap as it relates to Indigenous peoples, people with visible minorities, and people with disabilities. And the reason why I think that's really important to note is a lot of this comes down to power, and those that are in a lesser position of bargaining power when they come into an organization tend to be paid the least. And over time, that salary does not catch up with them. And then when they apply at their next job and they're asked, oh, what did you make at your past job? And they have to say this lower than market salary. Then they end up getting paid for lesser dollar at their new job as well. And it follows and follows. So I did just want to agree very much with Mind the Gap. And one of the very practical ways to do that is when you're hiring people, not to ask them about what they used to make at their old job. That's a really great way to stop that inequity from following forward.
Oh, I love that. That's such practical advice and so real. And I know we talked about gender, but it's more than just gender. There's pay gaps across different demographics and disabilities and people groups. And so I thank you for highlighting that. And for those who are listening, we'd like you to just take a look at your compensation in your organization. And, if you like what you heard, please subscribe to our podcast, peoplemanagingpeople.com or wherever you get your podcasts, and head to our website and leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you. So with that, thank you. And thanks again, Robin. And we hope you tune in again soon. Take care.